The bathroom mirror reflected what Sarah had been avoiding for weeks, the puffiness around her eyes that no amount of concealer could hide, the way her skin seemed to have lost its luminosity despite the arsenal of serums crowding her vanity. At 38, she looked older than her mother had at 45, and the realization hit her like cold water. Her phone buzzed with another email marked urgent. It's 6:47 a.m. on a Saturday, and her boss was already pulling her back into the vortex of deadlines and conference calls that had consumed the last 3 years of her marketing career in downtown Seattle. Sarah's reflection stared back, exhausted despite 8 hours in bed, bloated despite eating barely anything yesterday, aging despite spending more on skincare than groceries. The irony wasn't lost on her that she worked for a wellness brand, crafting campaigns about self-care and balance while surviving on protein bars and anxiety. Her latest project involved launching anti-aging products to women who, like herself, were desperately trying to reverse the visible toll of modern life. As she scrolled through her phone, a documentary trailer caught her attention. The Timeless Women of Kyoto. The thumbnail showed elderly Japanese women with skin that seemed to glow from within, their faces serene and unlined in ways that defied their obvious age. Sarah paused, thumb hovering over the play button, struck by something indefinable in their expressions, a quality of presence that felt foreign to her own frantic existence. She clicked play, settling onto her unmade bed with a cup of instant coffee. The documentary opened in pre-dawn Kyoto, following women in their 60s and 70s as they moved through morning rituals with unhurried grace. No ring lights or filters, yet their skin possessed a luminosity that her 20-something Instagram influencers achieved only through digital manipulation. The narrator mentioned something about fermented rice water, silk cloths, and eating patterns that seemed almost absurdly simple. Sarah found herself leaning closer to the screen, studying the way these women held themselves, the deliberate pace of their movements, the small ceramic bowls they used for meals that looked impossibly tiny compared to her own dinner plates. One woman, introduced as Emiko-san, caught her attention particularly. She moved through her traditional home with fluid grace, her morning routine involving what appeared to be ordinary objects, a simple wooden table, ceramic bowls, silk cloths, yet everything seemed imbued with intention. When Emiko-san held up a small rice bowl, explaining through subtitles how it had belonged to her grandmother, Sarah noticed something that made her pause the video. The bowl was beautiful in its simplicity, cream-colored ceramic with a subtle blue rim, perfectly sized to cradle in 2 hands. But more than its appearance, it was the way Emiko-san held it, with reverence, as if it contained something precious beyond mere food. Sarah glanced at her own breakfast setup, an oversized mug of coffee and a protein bar wrapper on her nightstand, crumbs scattered across her laptop keyboard. She rewound the segment, watching again as Emiko-san demonstrated how the bowl served as her guide for every meal. Not through restriction or deprivation, but as a gentle boundary that honored both hunger and satisfaction. The camera lingered on her face as she ate, showing none of the guilt or urgency that characterized Sarah's own relationship with food. When her phone rang, her best friend Maya calling with weekend plans, Sarah felt an unexpected reluctance to return to the familiar rhythm of mimosas and complaint sessions about work, dating, and the general impossibility of feeling good in their own skin. "I saw the weirdest thing this morning," Sarah found herself saying, instead of her usual greeting. "Please tell me it's not another wellness influencer promising to fix your life with lemon water," Maya laughed, but her voice carried the edge of someone who'd watched her friends cycle through countless health trends. "No, it's different. These Japanese women who look incredible without doing any of the stuff we think we're supposed to do." There was a pause. Maya had been her witness through 3 different personal trainers, 2 nutritionists, and a brief flirtation with biohacking that had left Sarah more exhausted than ever. "Sarah, you know I love you, but maybe we could just have one conversation that isn't about figuring out how to fix ourselves." After they hung up, Sarah found herself alone with the Pause documentary. Emiko-san's hands still cradled around that small ceramic bowl. She thought about her grandmother's china, packed away in boxes since she'd moved to her cramped studio apartment. Specifically, she remembered a set of small rice bowls her grandmother had used daily. Simple white ceramic with delicate blue flowers around the rim. The bowls had seemed impractically small to Sarah's American sensibilities, but her grandmother had lived to 92 with the kind of vitality that seemed impossible in Sarah's current world. She'd never counted calories or owned a gym membership, yet photographs showed her maintaining the same gentle curves and bright eyes well into her 80s. Sarah pressed play, letting the documentary wash over her as morning light crept through her apartment's single window, illuminating the chaos of her life spread across every available surface. If you've ever felt tired even after a full night of sleep, or frustrated with diets that don't last, tell us in the comments which part of this story feels familiar, and stay with us for the next chapters. That afternoon, Sarah found herself in her storage unit, digging through boxes that hadn't been opened since her grandmother's estate sale 3 years ago. The musty air carried traces of lavender soap and old wood, scents that transported her instantly to childhood afternoons in her grandmother's orderly kitchen. The rice bowls were exactly as she remembered. 6 small ceramic pieces, each one fitting perfectly in her cupped palms. They felt substantial yet delicate, their blue flower pattern hand-painted with the slight imperfections that marked them as treasures from an era when objects were made to last generations, not seasons. Back in her apartment, Sarah cleared a space on her kitchen counter and set one bowl in the center. Compared to her usual dinner plates, it looked almost comically small, like a child's toy. The documentary had mentioned something about portions and satisfaction, concepts that felt foreign to someone who'd spent years either restricting food entirely or eating mindlessly while scrolling through her phone. Her first attempt at using the bowl came that evening, when she portioned out her typical dinner salad. The greens barely filled the bottom, making her usual meal look sparse and unsatisfying. But as she added vegetables, nuts, and a small piece of grilled chicken, the bowl began to look abundant, even overflowing. The visual shift was subtle but profound. The same food that had appeared meager on a large plate now seemed like plenty. More intriguing was what happened when she ate. Without the endless white space of a dinner plate stretching before her, Sarah found herself naturally slowing down, each bite requiring intention. The bowl's size demanded mindfulness. There was no room for distracted eating while answering emails or watching Netflix. The first few days felt awkward, almost ceremonial. Sarah caught herself reaching for larger plates out of habit, her nervous system interpreting the smaller portions as deprivation. But something interesting began to happen around day 4. She started feeling satisfied in a way that had nothing to do with fullness. The shift was so subtle she almost missed it. Where she usually felt either restricted and hungry or overly full and guilty, the bowl seemed to create a third option: contentment. Not the desperate satisfaction of finally being allowed to eat, or the heavy lethargy of having eaten too much, but something gentler, a quiet sense that her body had received what it needed. Maya noticed the change during their weekly coffee date, though she couldn't quite articulate what was different. "You look, I don't know, less frantic," she observed, studying Sarah's face across the small cafe table. Sarah hadn't mentioned the bowls or the documentary, anticipating the familiar dance of enthusiasm followed by skepticism that characterized most of her health experiments in Maya's eyes. "I've been trying some different things," she offered vaguely. "Please tell me you didn't buy another expensive supplement," Maya groaned. "Remember the adaptogenic mushrooms that made you feel like you were vibrating?" Sarah laughed, remembering the $200 monthly powder subscription that had promised to regulate her stress hormones, but had mostly just made her anxious about spending money on unpronounceable ingredients. Nothing like that, just eating differently. The conversation moved on, but Sarah found herself thinking about the difference between her previous attempts at change and what was happening now. Every diet or workout program had felt like putting on a costume that didn't quite fit, a performance of health that required constant effort to maintain. The bowl felt different, more like remembering something she'd always known but had forgotten how to access. That evening, as she prepared dinner in her small kitchen, Sarah noticed other changes rippling out from this single shift. She was buying different foods, gravitating toward ingredients that looked beautiful in the small ceramic space. Processed foods that came in huge packages seemed suddenly absurd, while a single perfect tomato or a small portion of high-quality cheese felt luxurious. She was also eating dinner earlier, not from any rigid schedule, but because the bowl made her more aware of her body's actual hunger signals. When she waited too long to eat, the small portions felt insufficient. When she ate at the first whisper of hunger, the bowl's contents satisfied her completely. The most unexpected change was the silence. Without the familiar background noise of television or the blue glow of her phone screen, dinner had become a small meditation. The sound of chopsticks against ceramic, the steam rising from warm food, the gradual shift from hunger to satisfaction, all of it demanded a presence that felt both foreign and deeply familiar. Sarah thought of Emiko-san, moving through her morning ritual with unhurried grace, and wondered if this was how change actually happened, not through dramatic overhauls or militant discipline, but through small objects that gently reshaped the architecture of daily life. 3 weeks into eating from her grandmother's bowl, Sarah received an unexpected email from her doctor's office. Her annual physical was due, and the thought of stepping on a scale and discussing her lifestyle choices filled her with the familiar dread that had characterized her relationship with medical appointments for years. Doctor Martinez had been her physician for 5 years, witnessing her cycles of weight loss and regain, her requests for sleep aids and anxiety medications, her growing list of minor complaints that all seemed to stem from the same source, a nervous system that never quite calmed down. "How have you been feeling?" Dr. Martinez asked, settling into her chair with Sarah's chart open on her laptop. Sarah paused, considering the question. 3 weeks ago, she would have launched into her usual litany, exhausted despite sleep apps and melatonin, constantly hungry despite regular meals, stressed despite meditation apps and yoga classes. But something had shifted in such subtle increments that she'd almost missed it. "Actually better," she said, surprising herself. "More steady, I guess." Dr. Martinez raised an eyebrow, making a note. Sarah's weight had dropped 6 pounds, but more significantly, her blood pressure had decreased from the borderline high readings that had been creeping upward for the past 2 years. "Are you doing anything differently? Exercise program? New diet?" Sarah hesitated, knowing how absurd it would sound to credit a ceramic bowl with any meaningful change. "Just eating from smaller portions," she said finally. "Slowing down more." The doctor nodded approvingly, but Sarah could see her mentally filing the information under patient, finely developed self-control. It was a familiar dynamic. Medical professionals who saw behavior change through the lens of willpower and discipline, missing the more complex interplay of environment, nervous system regulation, and cultural habit. Walking home from the appointment, Sarah felt a quiet satisfaction that had nothing to do with the numbers on the scale. For the first time in years, a medical visit hadn't left her feeling like a failure or a project in need of fixing. Instead, she felt like someone who was learning to live in her body rather than at war with it. That evening, she called her mother, who lived in Portland and had been her grandmother's primary caregiver during the final years. "I've been using Grandma's rice bowls," Sarah mentioned during their usual catch-up call. There was a pause, then a soft sound that might have been tears. She used those every single day, her mother said finally. Even when we tried to get her to use bigger plates, she'd say that bowl was the perfect size for everything she needed. Did she ever diet? Sarah asked, realizing she'd never seen her grandmother engage in the constant food negotiations that had characterized her mother's generation. Never. She used to say that hunger and satisfaction were like a conversation, and if you listened carefully, your body would tell you exactly what it needed. After they hung up, Sarah sat in her kitchen holding the bowl, thinking about conversations and listening. The Japanese women in the documentary had possessed that same quality, an attunement to their bodies that seemed to come from decades of small, consistent practices rather than dramatic interventions. Maya stopped by unannounced the next evening, carrying takeout containers from their favorite Thai restaurant. "I got the usual," she announced, unpacking enough food for 4 people across Sarah's small dining table. Sarah looked at the spread, familiar comfort foods that had formed the backbone of countless Netflix and Complain sessions, then quietly retrieved her ceramic bowl from the kitchen. "What's with the tiny dish?" Maya asked, watching Sarah carefully portion out pad thai and vegetables. "It's my grandmother's. I've been using it for everything." Maya laughed, but not unkindly. "Are you trying to develop an eating disorder? That's not even a real serving size." Sarah felt the familiar tug of self-doubt, the urge to abandon her quiet experiment in favor of social harmony. But as she took her first bite, savoring the complex flavors that she usually consumed while distracted by conversation and screens, she realized something had fundamentally shifted in her relationship to both food and peer pressure. "I actually feel more satisfied eating this way," she said quietly. Maya looked skeptical, loading her plate with generous portions and settling in front of Sarah's laptop to cue up their usual episode of reality television. "Would you rather force yourself with willpower or redesign your environment and habits like this character is learning to do? Comment which path makes more sense to you, and share this episode with someone who needs a gentler approach to change." The real test came 6 weeks later, when Sarah's company flew her to New York for a week-long conference. Business trips had always been where her healthy intentions went to die. Airport food, client dinners, hotel minibars, and the general disruption of any routine that kept her feeling centered. She packed the ceramic bowl in her carry-on, wrapped carefully in a soft scarf, knowing it was probably absurd to transport a piece of pottery across the country for a work trip. But the bowl had become more than a portion control device. It was an anchor to a different way of being that she wasn't ready to abandon. Her first night in Manhattan, she found herself in a steakhouse with 3 colleagues, surrounded by portions that could have fed entire families. The familiar pressure to participate in the ritual of excess, multiple courses, shared appetizers, wine flowing freely, felt more intense than usual, amplified by the high-stakes energy of the conference and the need to prove herself among mostly male colleagues. "Sarah, you're being unusually quiet," noted James, her director, as the waiter delivered their 3rd round of drinks. "Everything okay?" She'd been watching the other diners, struck by the urgent way people seemed to consume food in this environment, as if eating were a competitive sport rather than nourishment. The contrast with her quiet dinners at home, mindfully filling her small bowl, felt stark. "Just tired from the flight," she deflected, but made a decision that surprised her. When the entrees arrived, she asked for a to-go container and quietly portioned out a small serving of her salmon, leaving the majority to be packed away. The action felt radical in this context, almost rebellious. "That's all you're eating?" asked Marcus from marketing, gesturing at her modest portion. "Are you on some kind of diet?" Sarah paused, aware that her answer would either invite commentary or curiosity from colleagues she'd have to work with for the rest of the week. "I've been eating smaller portions lately. It actually makes me feel better." "Good for you," said James, but his tone carried the subtle dismissiveness reserved for women's food choices. I could never survive on rabbit portions like that. Later, back in her hotel room, Sarah sat on the bed with her ceramic bowl, eating the remainder of her dinner in the quiet ritual that had become essential to her sense of equilibrium. The salmon tasted better somehow, eaten slowly and with attention, rather than consumed as fuel for networking performance. The rest of the conference unfolded differently than her previous business trips. Instead of the usual pattern of overeating at client dinners, followed by guilty restriction and irritability, Sarah found herself naturally gravitating towards smaller portions, taking breaks between meetings to walk rather than grabbing coffee, and sleeping better despite being in an unfamiliar environment. Her colleagues began to notice, though their observations came filtered through their own relationships with food and bodies. You seem really calm for conference week, Maya texted after Sarah sent her usual check-in message. Did you discover meditation or something? Sarah looked around her hotel room, clothes neatly hung, her grandmother's bowl sitting on the desk, next to a simple meal from the market down the street, her laptop closed rather than glowing with late-night work. She hadn't discovered meditation exactly, but something about the bowl's presence had created a different rhythm, even in the chaos of business travel. The breakthrough moment came on her last night, when she found herself at a networking dinner in one of those restaurants where the portions were artfully small and the prices comically large. For once, the serving sizes matched her internal sense of enough, and she realized how rarely that alignment occurred in American dining culture. Sitting across from a potential client, a Japanese executive named Tanaka-san, who ran marketing for a beauty company in Tokyo, Sarah watched him eat with the same unhurried attention she'd been cultivating. When the conversation turned to wellness trends and consumer behavior, she found herself mentioning the documentary about Japanese skincare rituals. Ah, yes, Tanaka-san nodded. My grandmother had many of those habits, simple things, but very consistent. In Japan, we say hara hachibu, eat until you're 80% full. Your grandmother's bowl sounds like wisdom. Something clicked for Sarah in that moment. This wasn't about adopting foreign customs or exotic practices. It was about remembering something her own grandmother had embodied, a relationship with food and body that prioritized sustainable satisfaction over short-term pleasure or restriction. Flying home the next morning, the bowl safely wrapped in her carry-on, Sarah realized she'd navigated the most challenging week of her professional year without the usual cycle of excess and self-recrimination. More importantly, she'd done it without feeling deprived or different, just steadier, more like herself. 2 months after returning from New York, Sarah stood in her bathroom, looking at the same mirror that had reflected her exhaustion and frustration just 3 months earlier. The changes weren't dramatic, no miraculous transformation that would inspire before and after photos, but they were undeniable. Her skin had regained some luminosity, not from expensive serums, but from the deep sleep that had become possible once her nervous system learned to calm down in the evenings. The puffiness around her eyes had diminished, replaced by a clarity that seemed to come from within. Most significantly, she carried herself differently, with less of the anxious energy that had characterized her movements for years. But the real revelation came that morning, when Dr. Martinez called with results from the follow-up blood work she'd requested. Your inflammation markers have dropped significantly, the doctor said, genuine curiosity in her voice. Your blood pressure is now in the optimal range, and your cortisol levels show a pattern consistent with much better stress management. What exactly have you been doing? Sarah paused, knowing that eating from my grandmother's rice bowl wouldn't adequately capture what had actually changed. The bowl had been a catalyst, but the transformation ran deeper than portion control or even mindful eating. I think I stopped fighting with my body, she said finally. I started listening instead. That evening, as she prepared dinner using ingredients she'd never bothered to appreciate before, a single perfect peach, locally grown greens, a small piece of wild salmon, Sarah understood what had really shifted. For years, she'd approached her health like a problem to be solved through willpower and external interventions. Exercise regimens, supplement protocols, meditation apps, sleep trackers, all attempts to impose control on a body she'd viewed as fundamentally untrustworthy. The ceramic bowl had introduced a different possibility, partnership rather than domination. Each meal became a conversation between hunger and satisfaction, with the bowl serving as translator. But the practice had rippled outward, affecting not just what she ate, but how she moved through the world. She went to bed earlier now, not from rigid scheduling, but because her body's signals had become clear and trustworthy again. She walked more, not as exercise, but as pleasure. She spent less time scrolling through social media, not from digital discipline, but because the dopamine hit paled in comparison to the deeper satisfaction of presence. Maya noticed the change during one of their coffee dates, though she struggled to articulate what was different. "You don't seem as hungry anymore," she said finally. "Not for food, but for everything. Like you're not constantly searching for the thing that's going to fix everything." Sarah considered this observation, recognizing its accuracy. The desperate quality that had characterized her approach to health, relationships, even work, had softened into something more sustainable. She wasn't fixed. She still had difficult days, still struggled with the demands of modern life, but she no longer felt broken. "I think I realized that most of my problems weren't actually problems to solve," Sarah said. "They were just what happens when you live out of sync with your own rhythm." That night, as she cleaned her grandmother's bowl and placed it on the drying rack, Sarah thought about inheritance and wisdom. Her grandmother had never articulated theories about portion control or nervous system regulation, but she'd embodied a way of living that honored the body's natural intelligence. The bowl had been her daily reminder that satisfaction wasn't about having more or restricting more, but about finding the sweet spot where body and mind could rest in contentment. That space, what Tanaka-san had called Harahachi-bu, turned out to be not just about food, but about life itself. Sarah pulled out her phone and finally responded to the documentary maker's request for viewer stories, something she'd been considering for weeks. 3 months ago, I was exhausted, despite doing everything right for my health. I discovered that my grandmother's rice bowl held more wisdom than all the wellness advice I'd been consuming. Not because it was magical, but because it taught me to listen instead of override. Small changes, sustained over time, can shift everything, not just what you eat, but how you live. Before sending the message, she added, "The secret wasn't learning new habits. It was remembering old ones." 1 year later, Sarah found herself in an unexpected conversation with her company's new intern, Jessica, a recent college graduate who radiated the same frantic energy that had once characterized Sarah's own approach to professional life. "I don't understand how you stay so calm during these crazy deadlines," Jessica confided during a particularly intense campaign launch. "I've tried everything, energy drinks, productivity apps, meal replacement bars, but I always feel like I'm running on empty." Sarah looked at the young woman across from her desk, recognizing her former self in Jessica's wide eyes and coffee-stained fingers. On impulse, she opened her desk drawer and pulled out a small ceramic bowl, not her grandmother's original, which remained safely at home, but a similar piece she'd found at a local pottery studio. "This might sound strange," Sarah began, "but have you ever thought about how you eat lunch?" Jessica blinked, clearly expecting career advice rather than dietary guidance. "I usually grab something from the vending machine and eat while answering emails," Jessica replied. "There's never really time for actual meals." Sarah smiled, remembering her own years of unconscious consumption, fuel disguised as food. "What if I told you that taking 15 minutes to eat mindfully might give you more energy than any supplement?" Over the next few weeks, Sarah watched Jessica experiment with slower eating, smaller portions, and the radical act of stepping away from her computer during meals. The changes were subtle, but unmistakable: less afternoon caffeine crashes, better focus during late-day meetings, a calmness that seemed to spread to her entire approach to work. Meanwhile, Sarah's own transformation had deepened and solidified in ways that surprised her. Her annual physical showed continued improvement in all the markers that had concerned Dr. Martinez the previous year. More significantly, she'd navigated a challenging breakup, a demanding project deadline, and her mother's brief hospitalization without reverting to the old patterns of stress eating and sleep disruption. The ceramic bowl had become so integrated into her daily rhythm that she rarely thought about it consciously anymore. It sat on her kitchen counter, a simple tool that had rewired her relationship not just with food, but with satisfaction itself. Maya, who had initially been skeptical of Sarah's tiny bowl phase, had quietly begun eating from smaller plates herself after noticing how much more relaxed Sarah seemed during their shared meals. "I hate that you were right about the portion thing," Maya admitted during one of their dinner dates. "But I can't deny that I feel less stuffed and guilty after we eat now." "It's not about being right," Sarah laughed. "It's about finding what works. For me, it happened to be remembering something my grandmother already knew. The most profound shift had been in Sarah's relationship with her own body. The anxious monitoring, the constant negotiation between restriction and indulgence, the sense of being trapped in biological machinery that couldn't be trusted, all of it had given way to something approaching friendship. Not perfect harmony, but a working partnership based on communication rather than control. Dr. Martinez had been particularly intrigued by Sarah's sustained changes, so different from the yo-yo patterns she typically observed in patients. "Whatever you're doing, keep doing it," she'd said during Sarah's most recent appointment. "Your body age markers suggest you're actually getting younger in some measurable ways." That evening, Sarah sat in her kitchen as autumn light filtered through her small window, preparing dinner with the unhurried attention that had become second nature. She thought about Emiko-san and the other women from the documentary, wondered if they knew how their simple rituals had rippled across an ocean to touch the life of an overworked American marketing professional. The bowl held tonight's dinner: roasted vegetables, a small piece of fish, a few spoonfuls of brown rice, portions that would have seemed inadequate a year ago, but now represented exactly enough. As she ate slowly, savoring flavors and textures, Sarah reflected on the strange alchemy of change. She hadn't become a different person, hadn't solved all her problems, or achieved some state of perpetual wellness. But she'd remembered how to inhabit her own life with presence rather than desperation. The bowl had been a teacher, showing her that satisfaction wasn't about having more, but about recognizing when she had enough. Later, as she washed the simple ceramic piece and placed it in the drying rack, Sarah felt a deep gratitude to her grandmother, whose wisdom had waited patiently in storage, to Emiko-san and the documentary makers who had preserved ancient knowledge, and to her own willingness to try something that had seemed too simple to matter. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, deadlines and decisions, and the thousand small choices that comprised adult life. But she would meet them from a place of steadiness rather than scarcity, nourished not just by food, but by the quiet knowledge that her body could be trusted, her hunger could be honored, and satisfaction was always within reach. If this story reminded you that real transformation comes from small habits repeated over time, not from overnight fixes, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to start this journey with you in the next story.